An interesting conundrum, an interesting situation, if you will. I tried to go on D Live and it wasn't working, but YouTube is working, so I guess we're just doing YouTube. It won't be very serious, I'm wearing my deep V-neck. It's January 20th. It's an interesting day. It's an interesting sort of day. It's an interesting sort of time. And I was thinking about the concept of solidity versus the concept of malleability. These two ideas. That the world is obviously going to throw a lot of negative stuff at us. And in order to resist and to remain, in order to not merely absorb all the bad things of the world and become bad ourselves, we have to present some kind of solidity to the world. We have to somehow be this object of earth, right? We look at the different elements: earth, water, wind, fire. We have to be earth with respect to the negativity of the world. But I think there's a problem that exists because when we look at the different cores, the different aspects of the person, becoming a pure thing of earth, becoming purely solid, makes you basically unable to act. And I would say a pure solid, this is what we call apathos. Without passion, this is like a rock, your pet rock. It doesn't cry, it doesn't laugh, it doesn't do anything. It simply is. It can survive quite a lot. The rock, the rocks of the Seven Sisters in southeast England, the rocks which have been there for quite a while, they do get eroded over time, but we think about these very old megalithic structures, Stonehenge. And so a rock as a solid can survive and persist for a very long time. We think of the Colosseum, the great granite, the marble, right? And so there's something to be said. There's a positive aspect to that. It resists the erosion of the world. But there's an issue that these things cannot move, right? They are stable and they're static. They are not dynamic. They're not capable of responding or even really reacting. They're not capable of moving things backwards or forwards. They're stuck in their ways and they cannot change, which is an interesting concept. Now tell me how the audio is today, because we've switched things up. We've created two separate platforms, one for the microphone, one for the mouse and keyboard. So hopefully when I bang my hands, it's not as, because I know when I touch the mic, I don't even want to do it. When I touch the mic, it sounds like, if you're wearing headphones, it sounds like someone's tapping on your earlobes. I don't want to do that. Tell me how the sound quality is. I'm going to make an adjustment over here. I'm going to make an adjustment that I should have made a long time ago. And then we'll explore this idea. We'll explore the idea of the solid and the water and the air and the fire. So I think this is actually where a lot of people are. I think we look at the world and we see the issues that we have, and we say, okay, well, I'm not going to let that affect me, so I'm going to be a solid. I'm going to be a crystal or stone. And then we look at these different factors, and then we see this inability of change, and it's a perceptual inability. It's the idea that nothing could change, therefore nothing should change, nothing is the proper thing to do, right? Nothing should be done. And then we look at the other elements, and I'm not sure how the 4 elements are going to go up to the tripartite soul. I'm not sure how that's going to match up. But it's clear that there has to be an aspect of the personality which can say no. There has to be an aspect of the personality which acts as a stopping block, as a wall, right? But if that's the only thing the personality is, then the personality has no capacity for change and for dynamicism. So then we get to the inward part in the core. And we could break it further down, but we'll just say there's the core, there's the internal. And at the most extreme, this would be fire, right? The most extreme malleability would be fire. Fire is even less, in a sense, in a metaphorical sense, maybe not scientific, but in a metaphorical sense, you can pass through fire without interrupting it. Wind provides resistance. You know, you're out on the ocean and a strong wind pushes the boat. Fire doesn't so much do that. Fire is extremely malleable. Fire provides very little resistance. We know we can have a hot air balloon and so on. But fire was thought to be lighter than air, and this is probably true in some sense that fire is a form of plasma. It's not merely a gas, but it's a plasma, fourth state of matter. And so, in a sense, it's more energetic, it's more malleable, it's more light. And this has to be the highest form of the core of the personality, this hyper-mobile, this hyper-dynamic, hyper-malleable core. And I think we often think about it as the opposite. I think often we think of things like, okay, well, in my core, I should be stable, but then I should be open-minded, and I should sort of allow ideas to come in and out of my mind. Like, you know, in my core, I should be this stable guy, like I know who I am, and I have all my ducks in a row. And then, but outwardly, I will pretend to sort of consider different ideas. And that's, I think, an idea of masculinity of people that have, where it's like you're a rock on the inside, you've got a heart of stone, but then on the outside you present this kind of fluffy devil-may-care exterior of like, oh, whatever, it doesn't matter, we'll do whatever. And so you're very kind of apathetic on the outside. And that's your concept of where you put your malleability. You say, well, in the superficial things, I'll be sort of malleable, and you consider that to be the outer shell of your personality. Well, you know, it's like clothing that I wear. Okay, well, I'll wear the fashion of the day, and so I'll have this outward malleability. I'll allow myself to be shaped by the world in an outward sense, but in an inward sense, I'm going to have this heart of stone. I'm not going to be affected by anything. I'm going to be inwardly. I think this is a kind of plan that people base off of the idea of the dark triad and sociopathy of like, well, outwardly, I'll pretend to be a nice guy. Outwardly, I'll pretend like, you know, I am sensitive to people's feelings. Outwardly, I'll pretend like I'm empathetic. Outwardly, I'll pretend like all these things so that I can, you know, manipulate people, so that I can fit into a social scene. So, you know, when people say, oh, someone died today, I can be like, oh, that's so terrible. So I'll outwardly present a kind of emotional malleability. Outwardly, I'll present myself as a real human being, but inwardly, I'm going to be a robot, a Terminator, heart of stone, a killer. You know, inwardly, I'm a sociopath. And this is the ultimate strategy. This is the manipulative strategy, the Machiavellian strategy that we should aspire to as an ideal of a personality. But I wonder if we haven't got it exactly wrong. I wonder if, in truth, we shouldn't consider the ideal to be that which is outwardly tough, that which is outwardly toward the world, outwardly cynical, outwardly defensive and outwardly stable, right? So when we receive the news of the day, it doesn't affect us. We're not caught up in the moment. We're not reactive to it, to the exterior world. But on the interior, we actually have a high degree of sensitivity. So in this model, you kind of create a semi-permeable membrane. You sort of create your gates around your city, and then you've got a big, beautiful door, and you decide what you want to let in emotionally and what you don't want to let in. But when you do let things in, that you allow yourself to be receptive to those things. And so being conscious of these two different kinds of models, I guess there's, four in total? You could be completely malleable, which is to say someone who is highly empathetic, highly emotional, and highly sensitive. The type of person where there's not simply pretending to be empathetic, but they actually are, right? That kind of person is highly manipulable, highly honest, unable to hide their emotions, no Machiavellianism whatsoever. Then you have the person who acts, the kind of crocodile tears. They pretend to be crying, but inside they're a sociopath. And then you've got the person who is maybe tough on the outside, soft on the inside. And then you have the person who's just tough all the way through, in the sense that they've lost their inner ability to feel emotion. And again, we imagine that to be like a robot or something like that. But I think oftentimes the people who don't have that kind of sacred place, that temenos within them, where they can feel emotion, end up not being very cool people, right? They end up not being very inspirational people. I think that's actually sort of the average person. I think the average person, in a way, is not so excitable, right? I think the average person, in a way, lives most of their life in their internal monologue. Their internal sense of themselves is not very emotional at all. I think children start off as highly emotional, highly emotionally receptive, in that they are perceiving the world, they're reacting to the world, their laughter, their tears, all of that is just out on the table. And over time, people say, well, I learned to be cynical. I think sometimes the process is too thorough and it runs all the way through. And so when you hear something like, the Jesus praises the mentality of the child, or the spirit of the child, not necessarily the mentality, not necessarily the intelligence, but something deeper, the psychology of the child, I think he is calling to the idea of a youthful sense of passion, a youthful sense of the spirit, a youthful soul, which is receptive, which is capable of feeling. When you lose your feeling, when you lose your passion and your drive, there's very little left to compel you other than the outside world. And if you've become numb to the outside world, then there's really not much at all. I mean, there are some people where I suppose they might feel internally dead inside, but they're still sort of receptive to the world. There are people, there are so many people these days who will talk about, and I don't even want to use the terms, I don't even want to use the word. The German is Lebensmüde, tired of life. And so you have a lot of these people who will say things like, I don't care for my own life. You'll hear a lot of people say things like, I don't care what happens to me. And this is a person who, in a sense, has to have lost, well, not necessarily. Let me try to rephrase this. You could have someone who says that in a heroic sense of like, I'm going to war, I'm going to battle, I'm going on a journey, I'm going on a quest, I'm seeking the grail, I'm seeking the princess, I'm seeking the glory, and I'm not afraid of what happens to me. That's something different. The absence of fear is not the same thing as this kind of death wish. These are two different things, and sometimes they become confused, and sometimes they could even be in the same person. But you find people who are the opposite of heroic, people who are afraid of the monster under their bed. They're afraid of, they're afraid of all kinds of things. They're afraid of the air. They're afraid of other people's faces. They're afraid of people touching them. They're afraid of all sorts of things. The hypochondriac, the neurotic. They're afraid of all kinds of different things. And their fear is the opposite of the hero who says, I have no fear. I don't care for fear. I laugh in the face of fear. So those are two different mentalities. And I suppose they could get intermixed in the sense of tragedy. If, you feel that something so tragic has happened that you lose your fear, and at the same time, you are also tired of life. So you lose something important to you. And this kind of emboldens you in a way, but also makes you tired of the experience of living. So they're not totally mutually exclusive, but they are different. And I think there are people who have no heroism at all. They have no real capacity for self-sacrifice. They have no capacity. They really don't care about other people so much. In their day-to-day, they don't have anybody to care for. They would probably be better off having children, many of these people, but some of them, even with children, they would be so, in a sense, they would be so closed off and solidified in this part of themselves that's supposed to care for the children. They would be cut off from the children. They would be too busy being depressed. They would be too busy being scared. They would be too busy feeling tired of life. And they would neglect the children emotionally. They wouldn't be able to connect with the children. They'd be sad all the time. So there are people like this who, you talk to them and they say, I don't care what happens to me. And they're not saying it because they want to sacrifice. And they're still fearful. They'll say, I hate myself, and yet they'll still be fearful. These are the types of people who will say, I have low self-esteem and I hate myself. But don't touch me. Don't look at me. It's like, well, what do you have to fear? So they have this kind of hypocritical dual consciousness where on the one hand, they don't care about their future, they don't care about their present, it's just this bundle of negativity, and yet they're still, in this very reactive way, trying to protect themselves, and so they're very easily manipulated by fear. And again, I think this is what it looks like, probably, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think this is what it looks like to have a heart of stone, and armor of flesh. Meaning this is a person who's no longer sensitive to the call of the heart, which is always toward self-sacrifice and glory and greatness and heroism. It doesn't, and you could say, oh, well, are we talking about men? Are we talking about women? But even, I would say, the call to love, right? Generally, the call to love, the call of the heart is the call to love. And when someone is stony in their heart, when they're solid in the heart, then they become incapable of loving themselves, loving other people, loving life, loving the world. And so everything seems bleak and hopeless and terrible. They're no longer sensitive to the goodness of the world, and yet their armor is like flesh. Their outward, the way that they deal with, oh, I've broken some regulation, or oh, I'm fearful of what people will say, or I couldn't give a public speech, or I can't talk to people, I can't make friends, I'm anxious. So again, it's this kind of worst of all possible worlds. And if we understand that that's basically the worst of all possible worlds, then, the best would be the opposite. The best would have a heart of flesh and to have armor of stone or earth or metal that protects you from the fears of this world. Don't fear the world. Don't fear what's going to happen. Don't fear these outward things. Don't fear, oh, well, there's people are going to jail and people are losing their jobs and those are things I suppose to be aware of, right? So emotional receptivity and reactivity is not the same thing as intellectual understanding. You can be aware of what's going on in the economy, and at the same time not allow yourself to despair because of it. You can be aware of a bad situation affecting you and other people, and you can try to mitigate it the best you can. You can deal with it and try to problem solve. But to have an armor of stone, I think, means that you don't allow yourself to be controlled, manipulated, threatened, and driven to despair by these things. You don't allow this to affect your heart, that you have a degree of separation, you have space. You say, well, these are problems of the mind. These are problems to be dealt with intellectually. But I'm not going to allow these things to define my world. I'm not going to allow these outer things to define my vision of reality, to define my vision of the universe, of God. I'm not going to start blaming and totalizing and labeling, okay, well, these bad things are happening, so everything is terrible. No, I kind of create you could call it a cognitive dissonance. You create a cognitive separation. You say, those are the things outside. Those are the things, the antagonists. Those are the things that we're in opposition to. And we keep those things separate so that we can have an internal world, and we can have a world of the heart, and a world of love, and a world of innocence, and a world of childishness, and a world of the temenos, and a world of passion, and a world of fire. And that's where the motivation comes from. Motivation doesn't just come from the pure discipline of, okay, I'm going to do this every day, and if I do it wrong, I'm going to give myself 30 lashes. And I mean, maybe that works for some people. But to motivate purely through the stick, I mean, that is basically, in a sense, that is the mentality of the slave, the person who is only motivated by fear. Oh, I'll lose my job. I'm afraid of what people will say, or oh no, everything's crashing down, or what's going to happen, or the civilization, or all the people, everyone's going to die. When that's on your mind, and that's your day-to-day, and when you say that's the thing that motivates you most, when I hear people talk about motivation from fear, when you say, like, what's the most important thing, you ask them, like, what's on your mind? What motivates you? What gets you out of bed in the morning? They say, well, I'm afraid our civilization's going to collapse. I'm afraid everything terrible is going to happen. I'm afraid. So their primary motivation is fear. So their primary motivation is this terrible thing's going to happen. We're all going to die. I would argue that's a pretty bad mental space to be in. I would also argue that's the mental space that a lot of people are in. And throughout history, that's been the mental space that most people have occupied is, oh, if we don't do this, we're going to lose the food and die. I mean, in some senses, that's the state of animals, oftentimes. Just living in a constant sense of fear and anxiety and nervousness. And you sometimes you examine insects and various small, and the smaller the animal, typically the more fear they have. The more they live in fear. You look at a mouse or a rat or a cockroach or one of these little insects, and they're always sort of engaging in this twitching and cleaning, this kind of nervous cleaning behavior. They're cleaning their whiskers. They're cleaning the insects. They'll rub their legs together. They'll clean their legs. They engage in this kind of nervous behavior. They'll stop and they'll listen and they'll perceive. And then they'll run around and they'll do all this stuff, like the deer in the headlights. So you see this kind of mentality. You see this sort of behavior versus the larger animals do not live in such a state of fear because they don't have to. Because their life is much more a life of, sort of lumbering around and kind of doing what you want pretty much because you can, because you're a big animal. You're a big animal. It doesn't say they never have fear, right? Even elephants can be afraid. But for the most part, you're just kind of, running around and having fun. Think about these animals when they gallop. The horse, or the elephant, or the bison, many of these larger animals, when they gallop, think of the way that they move versus the cockroach. The cockroach is kind of flitting, he's flitting from place to place and he's stopping. He's flitting and stopping. These animals, they engage in a much more sort of playful and they can even afford to expend their energy. And so they, unlike the cockroach who's constantly searching for food, and no, you look at the horse, and the horse is playing. The horse is bucking around and playing. So we see the difference in the mentality in the animal kingdom, and we look at humans and we see the difference in mentality. We see people who are motivated by fear, people who are motivated by death and thanatos and all the terrible stuff that's going to happen. And so in order to motivate those people, you have to put them in a constant state of fear. Well, that's stressful, and there are consequences of that. When you tell them, hey, actually your fear is irrational, actually, living in a culture of fear means that we're not able to build, we're not able to love, we're not able to step back, we're not able to play, we're not able to do all of these things because you're living in a constant state of fear. You're only being motivated by the negatives. They're incapable of dealing with that, because even if they understood what you were saying, it's in their nature, whether it's unchangeable or not, but their nature is to only be motivated by fear. So when you take away their fear, let's say they're smoking weed, let's say they're just relaxing, whatever, if you take away their fear, maybe you ideologically, you explain to them why they're wrong, then they are no longer motivated. Whereas the person who's motivated by positivity and love and goodness, and who refuses to see things in a negative light, in the sense of we're aware intellectually of the bad things that are going on, but we don't allow that to define our story. We don't say, well, I was born into a terrible world, and I wish I was born 50 years ago, or I wish I was born 100 years ago, I wish I was born 1,000 years ago. And they just keep going on, and oh, it's such a terrible thing. You don't allow your story to be defined by this kind of, in many senses, false nostalgia. But you look at the world and you are grateful. You're grateful for the challenges that you have. You're grateful for the time that you were born into. And you look at everything that you're up against, and you take joy in everything that you can do, and you view it almost in relative terms, rather than this sense of, oh, well, if I don't X, Y, and Z, then everything's a failure. If we don't, a lot of people were saying, if we don't win this election, then it's all over and we're all going to jail. People saying that, it's like, okay, well, you set up an objective standard that's not really controllable by yourself as an individual. It'll turn out the way that it has turned out, and there's not much you can do about that, right? So when your locus of motivation is sort of out there in the world of the political, or out there in the world of the economic, or out there in the world of this big, giant global system that you don't really have a lot of control over, well, then basically your emotional well-being is at the behest of people who, frankly, not only just they don't care about you, but they actively want to demoralize you to hoard more power for themselves. So it's kind of a silly thing, and I understand why people get sucked into it, again, because this is that kind of collectivistic, and, people are trying to get on a team, people are trying to be part of a tribe. But what ends up happening is now your emotional well-being is captured by a system that doesn't like you, that wants you to feel bad. Doesn't sound like a great place to be, right? Versus you acknowledge all that, you're realistic about that, and actually you're able to be realistic because you're not emotionally entangled in it, because you're not emotionally involved in it. And there's a lot of people who say, oh, well, that's a cope, or, oh, that's, what do they call it, sniping from the sidelines, or people use this term clear pill. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that people describe it. I say that you can still be involved in these things, and you can still be motivated about these things, but we have to recognize the different psychological types. There are people who probably will always be the type of people where you can only motivate them through fear. And if you want to reach those people, if you're a propagandist with a big audience, that couldn't be me. But if you were such a person, you would probably fearmonger. You would fearmonger in order to motivate your audience. But in terms of the internal motivation of the individual, fear-mongering yourself, trying to sort of gaslight yourself or motivate yourself via fear, hyping yourself up. You're watching people watch videos of crime. They'll watch videos of innocent people getting beaten or murdered. They'll read stories on the daily about, oh, this old person was murdered, this person was abused. And they'll read that and they'll say, well, this is the fuel that motivates me to live my life. I mean, what kind of, isn't that kind of, do we see where we're going with this? At some point, you're being motivated by failure. You're being motivated by negativity. And again, there are a lot of people like that. I'm not saying it doesn't work to an extent, but that it has its own consequences. It has its own limits. And it's sort of self-destructive and kind of self-fulfilling in a way, that if you're always seeking out negativity as a form of motivation, as I think so many people, that's their motivation to read the news, is I'm going to read the news and then I'm going to be very angry and then I'm going to do something. And that something, usually, honestly, if we're being completely honest with ourselves, isn't very significant. It's not very productive. It's not really anything to be, it's like, well, if that's what motivates you, then maybe you'd be better off being not motivated, right? I mean, if that's what we're going to end up doing. So, the alternative model is you say, okay, we're going to have some kind of disciplined interaction with the world. You can call it stoicism, but I don't call it a thorough stoicism. I call it a selective stoicism. I say that we can be sort of stoic and we can be disciplined and duty-oriented with a lot of these things. And again, I'm not giving you a prescription for propaganda or mass audiences. I think that's a different thing. But sort of on an individual level, that you don't allow yourself to be emotionally captured by these things. But at the same time, if you cut off that source of motivation, you have to replace it with another source of motivation. You can't just be purely apathetic. You have to replace one pathos with another. And so what comes along to replace that is a more internal, personal, intimate, emotional attachment to real things, to real people, to things that you can perceive, to things that you have a degree of control over. The relationships in your life, right? Not to say that you're ever going to have complete control over, your environment. I mean, you could go out, live in the woods, and the bulldozer comes down and the loggers come and they cut down the trees, whatever. So, you can try to escape the world and separate yourself from the world, but ultimately we are in the world. We have to act in the world. We have to act politically. We have to be aware of it. We have to take it into account. But what I'm saying is, imagine sort of like the hermit crab has the outer shell and then the inner soft, gooey body. And those are both sort of necessary. If the hermit crab himself was hard, well, he would never be able to molt. He would never be able to escape his shell and go to another one, right? So he could never evolve. He would be stuck. He would not be mobile. And that's one of his advantages, right? With regards to politics, in a sense, you look at the last 4 years and you look at the structure and the cast of characters. Well, they're gone. That's an old shell now. That's a broken shell. That's a shell with a big old hole in it. And if you're still in that shell, you're going to get gobbled up by, I don't know, a tuna fish. What eats a hermit? I don't even know. Lobsters? What eats a hermit crab? You know what I'm talking about. Some big, scary, I don't know, arthropod, arachnopod, some kind of scary primordial crocodile or something's going to come along and eat you up because you're stuck in a shell with a big hole. If you make yourself solid internally. But you have to have a kind of gooey inside. You kind of have to have an inner, like so many good candies in the world, it's not soft on the outside, hard on the inside. I mean, unless we're talking about Hershey's chocolate bars with almonds, then it is sort of soft on the outside, hard on the inside. I'm contradicting. Or Almond Joy, where you have the soft almond and then the soft coconut on the outside, hard almond on the inside. I'm contradicting myself with all these good candies. But anyway, a lot of them have a kind of hard outer shell and then a gooey inside. That's what I'm trying to say. So we have to allow for that gooiness in our life, but we have to be smart, I guess, in the way that we are gooey, in the way that we are. And I'm thinking about Victorian England and the Victorian era where, with regards to sexuality and Puritanism and manners and formalism and the way that you shake someone's hand, the way that you eat with a fork, the way that you dress. I mean, you could not go out dressed like I'm dressed right now. You have to have all sort of accoutrement. I'm thinking about the sense in which they were very, things were not loosey-goosey. Things were exactly in their place. But then you also think about the romanticism and the emotionalism and, men walking down the street holding hands and, basically writing letters of love and friendship to one another. That we, in our era, we think, okay, well, it's the opposite. You go out and you're wearing your pajamas. You eat with your hands. There's no manners. You're just using swear words all the time, cuss words. And none of that matters. But then with regards to intimacy and friendship, it's like, oh, we can't hold hands. That would be gay. We can't, you can't write a love letter to your friend. That would be gay. You can't tell your friends you love them. That's so everything then, sexuality becomes like this last holdout of intimacy, right? Love and intimacy is basically banished from friendship and relationship, and it can only exist in this little hideout of sexuality. Sexuality is like the last place that we allow ourselves to be intimate, but not even then. You look at these stories of these women. I'm thinking of people want to associate me with, like, what do they call these people? The realist left or whatever. And I'm not, look, I don't really care too much for the labels. It's not the label that I use, but people say, I guess there's these people, I forget what they call themselves, the Red Scare, and you've got some women. And I've heard audio clips where they're like, yeah, I think my body count is 100, and they talk about the way that they perceive sexuality at that point in their lives, because again, the intimacy and the passion, the gooiness of life, I would say the flame of life, but there's different ways to. I'm trying to kind of really impress physical, tactile, concrete things into your mind. But that aspect of life, for whatever reason, they were unable to have that. And so, they go to sexuality as a refuge. It's like, okay, well, the whole world is devoid of pathos. Everything's ironic. Irony is a form of defensiveness, right? Irony is I'm not actually going to engage earnestly with the thing in itself. Like, we think of something like square dancing. Oh, well, square dancing is silly. I could never... that's for hillbillies and hicks or whatever. But there are people still who live in West Virginia who actually do square dancing because it's fun. It is fun to do square dancing. It's enjoyable. It's the thing. You're not doing it ironically. You're not doing, haha, it's a big joke. No, you're doing it because it's fun. And you're laughing not because it's ridiculous or stupid. You're laughing because you're having a good time, right? But we've banished that from our society, essentially. We've banished laughter and fun and love. And so everything is ironic. Everything is a joke. Everything is this Seinfeld. It's so ironic. We're laughing because everything's neurotic. And, did anybody really ever love each other in Seinfeld? That's a good question. I'm thinking of George's parents. His relationship with his parents is a model of that's the most important family relationship. The rest of them are friends, right? Elaine and Jerry and George and Kramer. They're all friends, but the big family relationship is George and his father and mother. Where's the love in that? It's all just, it's funny, it's ironic, and we say, it's problematic because it's a comedy, and you want these kind of clownish, great, ridiculous sort of things in a comedy. But why is it that we derive our source of laughter and enjoyment in life from this kind of irony and the suffering of others? rather than square dancing. How are these two opposite poles of living and thinking of this, a rural conception of laughter versus this hyper-urban conception of laughter? One is based on joy and movement and physicality, and the other one is based off of this kind of ironic schadenfreude of someone else's suffering and uncomfortableness. So that's much of the joy that is part of modern culture. The comedy, the Rick and Morty, the Family Guy, the Simpsons, all of it. The Friends. I mean, just the concept of the comedy with the laugh track. So much of it is based around, and I'm not saying you have Punch and Judy. You have very old comedy, right? So it's not to say that the idea of Schadenfreude and comedy is a new thing, but it just seems like the intellectualization, the mentalism of our comedy points to the fact that we're actually quite a joyless society. And that an intimate encounter with the thing in itself, of just enjoying something for the sake of its own thing, it really, again, it seems to be just, we have drugs, we have alcohol, and we have sex. And these are the refuges of actually enjoying something unironically, like, you don't have to be self-conscious, you don't have to be super self-aware. But what turns out is that these three, the drugs, sex, and alcohol, they're not even very enjoyable in themselves after a while. It's like, why are we doing this? Why are we making ourselves sick and miserable? And you talk to these women, or you listen to them talk about, oh, well, yeah, my body counts 100, and well, yeah, tell me about that. Tell me about what that's like on an emotional level, on a intimate level. I mean, what does that turn into? It turns into like a very sick and weird and kind of pathetic relationship with sexuality, where, you listen to these women on their podcasts, and I'm not just talking about, I'm not just picking on the what do they call themselves, the realist left or whatever, the Red Scare people. But there's a lot of women out there who have a podcast where they talk about all of the disgusting and pathetic and sad stories of men who couldn't perform, and things where something gross happened, and they're supposed to be getting enjoyment, and other people are supposed to be getting enjoyment listening to all these gross, pathetic, weird, and sad things. And it's like, what happened to sexuality as something that was just enjoyable in itself? What happened to sexuality? And what is your relationship with sexuality now that you've had so many partners and so on, and you've debased it in this way, and you've taken it from being something sacred into something that's, basically to be abused, something that is to be, used in almost like a quantitative way, used in this kind of injectory sense. It's like, well, I guess it's time for my happy pills or something like that. So even then, even the refuge of intimacy is itself, I think, under attack. So how do you reconnect with intimacy? How are you intimate? Well, you have to have a space for malleability in your personality. And a lot of people have turned to politics to solve that. They've said, okay, well, I'm going to be very emotional about politics. And I see this with people on the left, or the supposed left, the billionaire left, the mainstream Democrat Party, where they're saying, my father was a Trump supporter, so, he asked after he died that he be buried next to his wife, and so I decided to get him cremated and throw him in the trash. That kind of stuff. And from the right wing, they're saying, oh, well, this is a holy crusade, and they're getting very emotionally involved. So people are getting emotionally involved with politics, thinking that, okay, well, we've lost intimacy and emotional vulnerability and excitement and passion in so many areas of life. And so maybe politics can be the place where we can allow ourselves to be vulnerable and excitable and passionate. But I think, as we're seeing, politics is such a manipulated and a how do we say this? Well, it's political. It is manufactured. It is a lot of it is for show. A lot of it is part of a two-party system to get people. I mean, the whole thing is designed like, WWE to get people involved, to get people donating their time, their energy, and effort. And to what extent does any of that matter? In fact, as we see, it's really the lobbyists and the donors who are able to impact politics, not people who are voting, not people who are making small donations. And so understanding that, we see that, hey, maybe, you know what, politics is not the best place for us to be intimate. I want people to get into this state of emotional receptivity, but it turns out that maybe politics isn't the best place for that. Maybe politics is one of those areas of life where you kind of have to be cynical and disciplined and solid. So then where do we have that emotional vulnerability? We have to find a place for it. We can't just say, because look, it comes out in weird ways. When people can't be emotionally vulnerable, they turn to sex and drugs and alcohol. And when they can't find it there, or they refuse whatever because they're a conservative, then maybe they turn to politics. But politics isn't a great place for it either. So where are we going to find this vulnerability? And I think it has to be in the personal. It can no longer be in these things. Now, maybe there's a time and place for getting excited about politics. Maybe there's a time and place for partying. There's a time and place for sexuality, and maybe you could even say some moderate, ritualistic, drinking and whatever. But to say that that is the refuge, and to acknowledge and to be aware of how we treat intimacy in our lives and emotional vulnerability, to expect that those things are going to be the areas where we can be emotionally vulnerable, and that's going to work out over a period of 4 years or 8 years or whatever, let alone a lifetime, seems to be problematic. So to then say, all right, well, what do we have left? This concept of the personal. How do we interact with the personal? How do we deal? What does that even mean at this point, the personal? Because what I've been talking about in conversations, which will be revealed quite soon here, one of the things I was talking about, maybe once that conversation is out there, I'll be able to move past some of these topics onto newer things. The idea of games and friendship, that in order to connect with others on an intimate level, we need a mediating factor. And again, for most people, drugs, alcohol, and sex are mediating factors. It's not like, oh, we're just going to meet up and have a nice conversation. No, it's always, we're going to meet up and drink. We're going to meet up and do drugs. We're going to meet up and have sex. So the question then becomes, if these things are poor mediators for intimacy, at least when they're treated in a quantitative way rather than a qualitative way, It's one thing when they are integrated into a ritualism or a kind of social integration where they become solid and stable in their own right, like marriage. It's a public ritual, and now it's something stable and solid. You can invest in it rather than this kind of quantitative, here today, gone tomorrow. But how do people make connections with another without using those types of intermediaries? It has to be another kind of intermediary. The one I see people turning to is politics and ideology, as we're friends because we share the same politics. So what I'm finding is that people don't actually care about the politics. They just want an excuse to have friends with people. Now, they won't admit that, and they won't tell you that, because in some senses, the mediator is more important than the connection, because the mediation precedes the connection. But what we're actually looking for is the connection in itself. Who cares what the mediator is? If the mediator isn't working for us, we should choose a different mediator. I think a much healthier form of mediation is something like sports, team sports. People say, oh, I love football, I love the game of football. Well, it's a mediator for friendships and even memories and a nostalgia of a time when you did have those friendships and you can call people up and talk about it. The mediation, the form of the medium, whether we're talking on a phone, whether it's a cup with a string, whatever sort of mediation we're using, doesn't matter, but in a sense, it becomes more important than the connection because the connection relies upon the medium. Religion is another form of mediation. Does the religion matter more than the connections we form with people? Well, we sort of have to believe that in order to form those connections in the first place, right? So there's this weird sort of genealogy of friendship where in order to form the friendship, you have to have something in common. You have to have a common language. In order for us to be friends, we have to have some form of communication. It could even be nonverbal in the case of a human-animal relationship where, there's all kinds of nonverbal communication going on between humans and animals, and even verbal to an extent. But we both have to speak English. Now, what if we spoke Spanish? Well, that would be perfectly fine. As long as we both speak Spanish, it's going to work out. So is it important that we speak English in particular? Is it important that we speak English as opposed to Spanish? No, it doesn't matter whether it's English or Spanish. It just matters that we are both speaking English or we're both speaking Spanish. If I'm speaking English and you're speaking Spanish and we can't understand each other, it's going to be very hard for us to form that connection. So when you see politics getting so specified and important in people's lives, it's an indication of the decline of religion, because religion is failing to provide the same sort of mediation between people to form those connections, so politics has to step in and basically make friends for people, which I think is very problematic. So there's a number of ways to mediate between people, and I think out of all of these, you look at politics and it's terribly controlled by people who want to milk you of your life energy. And just getting involved with that on an intimate level and viewing that as a basis for making intimate connections, I think is flawed. So the next one, we've got religion, and religion has been it's been demonized and it's been ridiculed and it's been degraded, so that the religion that appears before us today is really quite a different thing than what it was. So what do we do with that? Do we say, oh, well, we'll return to the old religion? My problem with that is that the old religion fell prey to degradation. So if it fell prey to degradation, it must have had some kind of non-resilience. It must have had some kind of fragility built into it, or something it didn't take account for, or some kind of flaw or bug. Like when we think of a computer program or an operating system, it's not perfect, and it may have a back door that a hacker can use a virus to get into that, to degrade the system, to manipulate it. In that sense, I think you look at religions as they were, and you look in the way they were degraded, and you say, I guess there was something wrong with them, right? There was something wrong with the Roman religion that allowed it to become degraded, so that Christianity superseded it. There was something wrong with the form of Christianity that we had that allowed it to get to this point where, for most people, it's not really a functioning medium for forming intimate connections. Because that's really what matters, is our ability to form intimate connections. Now, in some sense, the highest duty of a religion is to form an intimate connection with God. But I think, in some senses, the process of forming an intimate connection with God is not entirely alien to the process of a medium creating intimate connections with other people. And in some senses, they have to be connected because they're both about forming relationships. So, how do we do that then? We have to take account of our situation. We have to recognize our situation. We kind of have to admit to ourselves that, what worked in the olden days, it kind of failed us. It didn't do us right. And you could give a number of explanations. You could say, well, it was designed from the beginning, some kind of Nietzschean analysis. It was designed in the beginning to lead us down the primrose path toward destruction, and that was always its 2,000-year plan, and now we're reaching the fruition of it. And there are other people who could say, okay, well, it was built for a certain people at a certain time, speaking to those people and dealing with those people, and then technology came that completely disrupted everything. If you invented Christianity in the year 100 AD in a way that would solve the problems of 2021, then it would not appeal or work for the people in 100 AD. So it's kind of like the environment has changed so much that you probably need something different. It doesn't mean that the old thing was bad or that it was created in order to destroy everybody. I do think there's something to the idea that all religions are created as a mechanism of control over people, but that's just the way biology works. Like when you have a social species, you're always going to have mechanisms of control, right? And centralization. And so I'm not going to be an anarchist here saying that, oh, well, isn't it terrible how Christianity has mechanisms of social control and enforces the legitimacy of the rulers through the divine right of kings, and isn't that terrible that, it makes serfs into all of us? It's like, no, we're always going to have a ruling class, and we're always going to have people who are ruled, and that's how all, collective arborescent species are, that aren't this, mass of yeast. If you want us to be a mass of yeast, then I guess, I suppose we would be egalitarian. We wouldn't have rulers. We're always going to have rulers. The question is, what is the mechanism by which rulers are promoted? Is it through a mercantile system of whoever can abuse copyright law and insider trading? Is it through a warrior system of engineering and meritocracy and strategizing and physical strength? Is it through a priestly system of theocratic philosophy and the manipulation of language and poetry? So there's different systems that we can use to decide the structure of our ruling class, at least in the abstract. I can't decide it, right? I'm just a dude. But there's different ways to have a ruling class. There's not just the way that we have it now. And I think these are things we should keep in mind when we think about, okay, yes, religion has somehow failed us, but that also doesn't mean we have to go to the other extreme and say that it was always bad or, it was a conspiracy. I mean, we also don't have to exclude the idea that people were thinking about religion in a very what is the Council of Nicaea? The Council of Nicaea is where guys literally get together and they debate what books should be considered canonical in the Bible. Okay, well, they were literally, that's a definition of a conspiracy. They got together in a room and they said, okay, fellas, what do you think should be in this book? What do you think God decided was good and what was not? That's, what more can we say about that, right? It's almost been an hour. We've been almost going for an hour. Let's see. Oh, hello, King. Lord of the Rings, Twink, Jelked, Arnie. Sounds good. I'm lagging. I believe you have a volume threshold on your mic, which makes your voice cut in and out. Might be something else, actually, but your audio cuts in and out every few seconds. Well, does that mean you're losing my words? If you're losing my words, that's bad. But if it cuts in and out in my pauses, then that's the intention. Good evening. The world punishes integrity, where integrity is related to wholeness, singular identity in all social settings. The world wants us to play the roles. Ave Caesar, lay Joe Biden. How does one succeed at no fap? Do not fap. Don't watch prawn. Life-affirming bravery versus life-negating recklessness. Well, there's something Aristotle would say about that. I need to be able to keep feeling and also to tell someone, at least one, about my feelings. It feels like that's what allows me to process feelings, but not a therapist. Yeah, well, a therapist is someone who's gone through an academic system funded by the billionaire class, which has decided, a certain scheme of analysis of the mind and a theory of the soul and psychology, which basically says the soul is like something that's fake and stupid. So when you go to a therapist, if you did go to a therapist and you told them about your thoughts and your feelings, they would say, oh, well, it sounds like you have a psychosis, and I'm going to recommend a psychiatrist who can medicate you, right? That would be the attitude that you would feel going into that. Now, does that mean every therapist is a bad person? Not necessarily, but there's also the fact that, men and women relate to one another in a different way. And a lot of therapists are women because it's psychology, and psychology is not a female-dominated degree necessarily, but compared to engineering, there's a lot more women in psychology. A lot of women say, well, I have a really bad, messed up mind myself, so maybe if I get a degree in psychology, I'll fix that, and then they end up becoming therapists. So, to find a man who you can talk to and who's able to actually engage with your ideas rather than view them as part of a psychosis or something, you want to talk to a philosopher therapist. You want to talk to someone who can communicate in your language. Again, to make a connection with somebody, you have to have a mediating language. If you walk into the session and you start talking to them about the things that you're concerned with, and those things don't concern them, and they don't understand, they're not able to at least empathize or sympathize with what you're feeling, and they just sort of disregard it as like, that's a bunch of gobbledygook, here's a pill, then you're not making a connection, and you're not actually having intimacy. What we need is intimacy. What we need is a mediating structure that allows us to have that trust, right? When you play a game with somebody, you would trust that they're going to follow the rules. And human beings are basically built to do that. When we speak language, we trust that I'm not going to have a stroke on stream and start foaming at the mouth and speaking in some kind of Lovecraftian language, right? We expect there's a certain grammar. So we follow the rules of English. You'd be amazed at how authoritarian we are. In 99% of all the things that we do, we're following rules that other people have laid out for us. We're not doing anything anarchistic, or every anarchist in the world is the biggest rule follower ever, right? So we just have to find common rules, and that's the problem, where there is a set of rules, but it's been built by the billionaire class to destroy their competition, which is, the middle class, and to an extent the lower class is not exactly doing so well either. But it's to destroy everybody else, and so that's what mainstream psychology is informed by. So we're like, okay, well, there is a set of rules, but it's designed to destroy us because of the logic of capitalism. So then, where do we turn to from there? And, I say then that's where you have to start talking about religion at some point, and what form. I think we just have to agree on some very basic things. I think when you can agree on those basic things, and if we have the same intention and we're working toward that, in some senses, seeking for a religion, I think, might become a religion in itself. Or at least has the properties of a proto-religion or something like that. People who are kind of honestly seeking toward discussing and philosophizing about these things. I mean, that's what the Greeks did, and I think that's ultimately how we got Christianity. I don't think you get Christianity without a bunch of Greeks getting together and saying, like, what is the nature of God? Like, they weren't just spouting doctrines and dogmas to one another. They were having conversations, and maybe that can be a mediating factor. I mean, that's supposedly, in a way, that's what much of Plato's school was like, although he had his own dogmas and dogmas and doctrines and esoteric knowledge and initiation cults. So, maybe we get there. Maybe if we seek hard enough, the teacher will appear. Maybe if we ask, if we get together and we pray together and we say, give us some answers here. Maybe from out of the shadows, Ben Kenobi, or, Odin, or Christ, or some guy with a beard and a hood is going to sort of emerge from the burning bush, and he's going to be like, so I heard you lads are looking for religion. Well, I got something. I mean, that is basically how things happen, right? If we if we go hard enough in the paint, then, things will happen. How do I fix this? Okay, where are we at? How are we doing right now? Because we're not, our viewership's not the best at this hour. I heard there's a major pandemic of agoraphobia among middle schoolers. They're really being ruined, losing their humanness. Save the children. Yeah, it's very sad, but we recognize what's going on, and we have to work together in a way that's constructive. I feel really bad that a lot of people who agree with you were sucked into a political movement, and instead of working to form things that would be, real, they were feeding into a nationwide soap opera / reality TV show with a man who was the star of a reality TV show for many years. So we've lost a little bit of time, I guess, energy and effort as a result, but it's, hopefully for the next 4 years, maybe people will realize that, investing in a reality TV star, putting all your dreams and hopes in him, rather than trying to build things with people who are not actors, but who are, really invested and trying to actually make things better, at least for themselves and the people, in the sense of the people that they know and can actually have an impact on, then, something positive could happen. They're probably doing it to make the next generation more sociopathic. The children will indeed be the longest and saddest tragedy of the lockdowns. I've heard good things about you, bro. Who is the big animal amongst us? I rode horses for years. They're the biggest cowards. Well, that's domesticated horses. I'm speaking more of wild horses. Never rode a cockroach. Herd animals scared of plastic bags. You can train a horse to be a war horse. Yes, very true. Yes, this whole monologue is stolen from Jordan Peterson. I am the rat. Well, whatever. Jordan Peterson can say things that are true, but it doesn't discount the fact that he is one of these, academics who's here to, defend the billionaire class at the end of the day. So, as much as people say, like, oh, well, I listened to Jordan Peterson and now I have friends and a wife and life is good. Well, that's great, man, but if you're feeding into the system of capitalism, my message is that we have to have a holistic approach. We have to address the personal, but we can't be going out there and being shills for capitalism like Peterson. I think we can do both. I think we can be good people to those around us, and we can be good people in a political sense, in the sense that we're not telling lies. And so when he goes around and he says, clean your room, okay, legitimate. And then he's like, don't disrupt the power structure, and be a liberal conservative, whatever that means, then that's where I have a problem. So I'll happily, if I'm stealing everything from him, I'll happily do that. He doesn't deserve any credit. He doesn't deserve anything. I was thinking today what I would do, some sort of political platform, not because that matters, but it's fun. It's fun. Maps of Austria-Hungary, they're fun. But I was thinking today, and I've said it before, but just remove copyright from these people. Like, Jordan Peterson doesn't deserve copyright. If people want to read his books, fine. He doesn't get any money. Like, if Hollywood wants to make Disney Star Wars, that's cool. You don't get any money from that because the government's not going to copyright it. We have this concept that, like, somehow it's a human right that whatever garbage you produce deserves to be protected by the government under threat of, jail and fines. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. If you produce crap, then it should be free. It should be free. The government, if I want to stream, Star Wars, whatever, Disney Star Wars, I should be able to download that, steal it, and upload it with impunity, and Disney doesn't deserve my money, and I shouldn't receive a punishment from the state. So that would be one of the very first things I would do if I had the ability. That would be a good first step. Conditioning is real. Can anyone here confirm if Nazarene... Okay. When did coping become a bad word or apply to things that aren't actually coping? It's kind of like the term cuck, right? It's become a very overused term. Making the best of a suboptimal situation seems like a recent change in the definition. I think the word coping means, the way that people use it is when you basically lie to yourself in order to, it's a form of self-deception. You lie to yourself to make yourself feel good. Like, oh, don't worry, guys. Like, something big's going to happen in March. Something big's going to happen in February. Just wait. Trust the plan. I think that's what they mean by coping. Rather than, okay, yep, this happened and this is what it is. But, the good thing is we can still do things in our personal lives, and we still have control over things that we can see and touch and feel. And, so I guess some people would call that coping, but obviously it would be coping in a more traditional sense of the word, but not in this new political sense. I want to be a primordial crocodile. Caramello perfection. Victorian England understood the necessity of ritual, which is the basis of religion, which is the basis of how people relate to the world. And I would add to that, and they relate to God, and they relate to each other. Ritual, the repetition of acts is a symbolic gesture to values, make those values real and tangible. At some point, we consider the ritual unnecessary. Well, we still have rituals like, watching porn and Netflix, and we have a lot of rituals. They just point toward values that destroy everyone who's not rich. Return to tradition, write letters on quality stationery. We all need to join hands. Irony should be a sin like usury. It is the worst thing about people my age. Irony is the great sin of Gen X. It's a hard one to repent from. I think young people nowadays are moving away from irony compared to young people before 2008. We need to bring back very manly, boisterous men's clubs where we gather and smoke cigars and shoot the breeze and drink gin and tell stories. In the modern world, one is deprived of ancestral experience of yore, such as a tribe member's experience their first kill in a hunt. Why don't you have a username? That's very strange. That was the premise of the Proud Boys, right? Yeah, it's now a terrorist street fighting gang. Well, I mean, look, who founded it? Some, Canadian, right? So the whole thing was doomed to be a federal plot, right? Everything that comes out of Canada is basically an entrapment scheme. But, I mean, that can be taken pretty literally. But yeah, I mean, I don't smoke cigars or drink gin, but, I suppose that's what we're going to have to do. I don't know. I think different types of people, different classes of people. I think like a working class man probably that's sufficient for him, and that's like at his level. And I don't think I'm quite at that level. I think I'm on a different level than drinking gin and smoking cigars. This can be emulated in our time through circumcision, where the blood they shed is their own to achieve full tribal membership. In this Faustian bargain, one loses their foreskin but gains a larger essence of humanity and a more hygienic penal experience. I do wonder if the internet is a place which allows for more authenticity compared to television, because there's direct confrontation with people. It's less centralized. Better respect female podcasters. Order of Man. Lots of people are trying to do this. Jack Murphy comes to mind. The problem, a lot of people are trying to do this in one way or another, but they're not depoliticizing in the right way. I think we still have to understand politics. I don't think we just there's a difference between understanding it and being emotionally invested. I think there are a lot of people who are very ignorant about politics and very emotionally invested. I think we should be the opposite. I think we should understand it from the most basic axioms and principles. It doesn't mean we understand, the day-to-day of what goes on in Washington, D.C. The minutia is not what I'm talking about. But we have to understand the fundamentals. A lot of people have it completely backwards, and that's a result of the fact that the best way to gain an audience is to prey on people's misconceptions and appeal to their misconceptions and tell them things they want to hear. You find out what people want to hear, and then you blast that, 24/7, and you get a big audience. When you explain to people, these misconceptions that everybody has, then, that's not the way to get a big audience and get a great. So if your object is like, okay, we're just going to get as many people in the audience as possible, that's a pretty perverse incentive with respect to the truth. But if you make the truth foundational and then the audience is secondary, I think that's probably, that's from my perspective, that's the way I try to do things. Other people act differently. Going fishing, being into politics probably simulates what it's like to be in an abusive relationship. Yeah, very true. Emotional vulnerability died with XXX Tension. I went fishing with Tom and he wouldn't stop singing Kumbayas. Perhaps I should clarify and say I see hints of authenticity with this generation. In the very least, they have more of a desire to escape. What conversation is he talking about? Did he do a stream with the Apple guy? We're going to meet up and stare into each other's eyes for about 2-3 hours. Then perhaps this is us. Yes. Well, that would be probably a better experience in many ways than just having sex, right? From the perspective of intimacy, I don't know. I know a lot of people where they can't stare into other people's eyes, but they can just, have a bunch of, what do they call it? Have a big body count, but you can't even look somebody else in the eyes. There's something wrong with that. We should do more staring in each other's eyes. And handing holds, holding hands, whatever. I'm like full of spoonerisms right now. Gen X connected with each other in our irony. Our irony was intimacy, but it became static and then exchanging cliches. Eat a whole onion. Yes, at some point, someday. I can't do it all the time. It's tough. I haven't had it in a while. I used to put it in the burritos. I go through phases. I was like, every day I'm going to eat a burrito, and then we stopped that, and now we're doing today. I put some meat on the pan, and then I took lemons, and I cooked the meat with the lemons, and I probably put in too much lemons, because now the meat just tastes like lemons. It was an experiment in cooking, okay? I was experimenting. It was a mistake. I will probably eat all of it, maybe with some pineapple to sweeten up that lemon flavor. But wow, we put in way too many lemons. I just like to experiment. I go through periods of plateau where I just eat the same thing every day, and then I'm like, let's just put 10 lemons, because I had a bag of lemons and they were just rotting in the fridge. And I was like, wow, what a waste of lemons. What if I just dump them all in this pan? And they're powerful lemons. Vulgar McLuhanism right here. Ken's brain is so big, I almost feel bad for him. You can tell he carries it around all day, not using it, thinking about all this stuff, but not saying it. It's very backhanded. What's the coughness? Everyone was tweeting. Ken's brain gives him forward head posture. Yes, very sad. What if I just did this for the rest of the stream? What if I just had perfect posture? Don't I look like odd? Don't I look bizarre? I'm like an alien. I'm like an alien now. I have to center myself. What if I just had perfect head? The other problem is I have a double chin. So that's great. I could just have perfect head posture for the rest of the stream. Yeah, the forward head posture is more a result of technology, I think, than the size of my cranium, to be honest. Let's pump it up. Let's pump up the jam, if you will. The only connections IRL I have are from church. I will have to watch the rest later. How do you mediate between... You know what? You're done. You're done. No such jokes like that will be made. Goodbye. Night Brian, Doompilled. Probably the fragility of those religions have more to do with modern communication. Let me scroll up. Fragility of those religions have more to do with modern communication technologies rather than just the philosophical concepts. Well, probably both. Biology is the control in this case. Christianity was a life raft when the empire collapsed, which is just what we needed. We need now, but somehow they believed and we can't. Well, it was the promise of something new, and Christianity is no longer the promise of something new. Too easy to distract people and pull their attention away from religious sermons. Hedonistic lifestyles derailed people's devotion to ritualistic enterprises. Can you trace a religion as a mechanism of control, a necessary byproduct of our biology, yet you say religion failed us? Why not say our biology failed us? Well, it can be both, right? Our biology is not perfect, and then the issue is that, our genes are not perfect, and we have mimetic systems, and those mimetic systems are not perfect, and the environment is changing because our mimetic structures are changing, and our genes are not sufficient to respond to those mimetic structures, so we need new mimetic structures to respond to mimetic structures. So, you could envision a human being who is born with all the genetic material necessary to deal with the society we live in, but I don't have the ability to change my genes. So there's nothing fruitful about saying our biology has failed us. I mean, I acknowledge that, and in a basic premise of why we have all this stuff in the first place is because our biology is not sufficient to solve these problems. So we need mimetic structures in response to mimetic structures. Mimetic structures create a cycle where they problematize our behavior, and then we have to create structures to account for those structures. It's sort of like if you've ever done computer programming and you're trying to do one thing and you have to do another thing, and you start building something and then there's a bug and you have to go back. As we have language, it creates problems, and then we have to create structures to mediate those problems and to address those problems. So, yeah, religion has failed us. Biology is insufficient to deal with language, which is a product of our biology. So, you could say it's a chicken or egg thing. I'm saying we should focus on mimetics because that's what you and I have the ability to change. Now, if you're a scientist and you can change people's genetics, I'm open to that discussion as well, but I don't think I'm honestly going to be part of that discussion, so I don't talk about it a whole lot. Let's see. 12 hours is like a day. The Wonder from Down Under. 12 hours? Really? You're going to do it at noonish? I thought I said 2 p.m. What the heck? All right. Hey, you do what you do. He asked me, what time should it premiere? I tell him, okay, I'll choose a different time. That's just how it goes. The Wonder from Down Under and the Brown from Uptown unite to brown pill the unwashed masses. Childless females go into therapy to substitute. See, I keep craning forward to read. Maybe I should make this bigger. Maybe I should make the text bigger. Okay. Childless females. It's also over here, so maybe if I center it more. Maybe if I center the text more, I'll be more... I don't know. Childless females go into therapy to substitute for their lack of family and children. People who go to therapy are children. Well, I've made a defense of children in this stream. When you get to this part of the chat, I hope you can communicate a good strategy for the New England Patriots this offseason and how they might best deal with their current quarterback situation. Yeah, I'll have to think about that and get back to you. The NFL draft is an esoteric performance depicting how youth are subsumed by our capitalist system, the temple of Saturn. Play like a dutiful slave today, reads the legendary sign outside the Notre Dame locker room. Hey, I heard you fellas were looking for a new religion. No, I don't. I'm not into Peter Thiel. Can you recommend some books on the class system and minoritarianism? I'd like to read on those topics. Well, if you're following me on Twitter, I've already muted you. If you're not following me on Twitter and you get in contact with me, or something on DLive or wherever, I have a link to my book you can read, but I don't know. Just Google search tripartite class system. Google search like minority survival strategy. I don't know. There's stuff out there. The new Dante will invert the layers of hell into the layers of heaven. It's impossible to have good posture. It's like, it's a strain on the upper back because I actually have to use my back muscles. Whereas here, they're totally relaxed. This is just so nice. Here, like, my back muscles have to be fully engaged. They're so weak. Starting to think, and I'm like, that's the only thing I do anymore. I do the face pulls, I do the external rotation, I do the IYWT, and they're still so weak. I don't know what I have to do. It's not the upper back, it's like the mid back. It's right above the lower back. It can get annoying. Architecture firms will try for competitions, lose, only see their project design pop up somewhere else. So I've heard from coworkers. Look, I'm not for abolishing all copyright. I'm just saying that if you're producing crap, if you're producing poison, you have no right to copyright, period, end of story. Too good for gin and cigars. Well, I don't know. It's just never been my thing. It's never been my thing. I just feel like if I'm drinking alcohol, then I'm just being... I don't feel like I'm making good intimate connections with people drinking alcohol. I feel like I'm just being silly. And I guess, I don't know, cigars, tobacco, nicotine. We need to start taking tobacco. It makes men healthy. Yeah, I don't know. I've never been a big fan of smoke. They say, and I read something about the sensitivity of the nose. People who have a more sensitive nose are more averse to casual sex. So I guess I have a sensitive nose. He wants a club where you put yourself in oil and fight. Yeah, that sounds more my style. I heard smokers get Parkinson's at a lower rate. Nicotine is neuroprotective. How do I access ancestral memories? Eat a whole lemon? Oh, well, we ran out of lemons, so that's not happening. I see a W, so we gotta find where the water... Where did I leave my water? It's somewhere, somehow... I got it. Okay. Thank you for that. What is L? What does L stand for? What if he accidentally developed a new recipe? Can the community chef... Can be the community chef on Aardvark's compound. I think that position is already taken, actually. Lemon is good on prosciutto and asparagus. Those are both good. I'm not a fan of Trudel Tom, but I wish you well on the podcast. Hope you still do solo streams. Well, we're not going to do it every day, so, I can still do solo streams. I don't know why you wouldn't be a fan of his, but I guess, to be honest with you, I have not watched all of his videos, his videos are scripted, right? So it's a very different style. I mean, people who like scripted videos don't like my streams, and people who like my streams might not like scripted videos. Nicotine-infused lemonade, Godward's hard lemonade. Pretty sure that would kill you. What sort of economic structure would be preferable to the one that is in place currently? Okay. Well, how about we have a system of economics where, we don't have laws in place where the structure of the government is such that you're just going to give all this money to these people and then be like, oh, they just earned it through hard work and, talent and stuff like that. I mean, look at everything that the government does. Look at the whole structure of it and how it's not just that they tolerate the abuses, but they create the potentiality for the abuses. They select the people who are going to be rich. I mean, it's a totally incestuous system of wealth and power. And the incentives there are, you have a bunch of people who want to eliminate the global population for the most part, but they don't want you to know that they're doing it, so they gaslight you into believing that the things that are killing you are actually the things that you like and enjoy. And, then when you complain about it, they create a bunch of scapegoats, like they tell you, oh, it's black people's fault, or, oh, it's the Christians' fault, or, they play all these games. So, what would be the better economic structure? I think the better economic structure, I think the way that we should distribute money is in response to things that we consider virtuous. So people who are accomplished. And I think there are two ways of doing that outside of the mercantile system. The warrior definition of success and the priestly definition. And so from the priestly structure, you would basically say that, well, the church is entitled to certain lands and resources, right? And ultimately, that's right, basically all the church has. And you give them certain, monopolies and whatever. Maybe you give them a monopoly over wine, or you give them a monopoly over Hollywood, or whatever. You give them certain monopolies. Right now, I mean, you look at our current priest class, and it's mostly academia. They have this monopoly on, everyone's told through social control, you have to go to college, you have to be $100,000 in debt to them. So we could do that with a priest class. The current problem with academia as a priest class is they're controlled by the billionaire class. So you have to unentangle that. You actually have to create an independent priest class, basically just by destroying the merchant class. And the way you destroy the merchant class is through technology and religion. Because right now they control everything, because everything's very predictable to them. Everything, they understand psychology, they understand democracy, they have everything under control. Well, you would introduce basically, horse archers. The Mongol Empire was a bunch of horse archers. And it would be some kind of technology like horse archery that they could, with all their money and all their wealth and all their predictable systems, they would just be smashed to pieces. And we would have to start back from square one in many respects and redevelop a priest class that was not, designed to poison the people, and, a warrior class that was not just functioning as a bunch of mercenaries. And so I think, we would have a priest class, and we would basically, you say, well, how does the priest class assign wealth? Well, you have a church hierarchy that says, okay, we're going to assign this much money to building temples, this much money will feed the poor, this much money, we pay on this and that. And so the priest class decides what to do with their money, and most of that's, spent on things that are meant to propagandize the population into believing in the religion and so on, which again is stuff we already have. It's just in the service of, the merchant class, right? But if it was, we're going to have a religion whose purpose is not merely to defend the billionaire class, but it's also there to glorify God and inculcate people with the values that are native to the priestly mentality, asceticism or whatever. That's how they're going to use their money, right? So it's not so much of oh, well, you don't like how money's distributed. How would you distribute it? What structures would you create? I'm not going to be the one creating the structures. These societal structures and economic structures are created by classes. They create the structures that are in their benefit. The merchant class creates structures that benefit themselves. The priest class creates structures that benefit themselves. Warrior class creates structures that benefit themselves. The situation we have right now is the merchant class effectively controls those other classes, and so those other classes are acting in a subordinate fashion, and their desires and their instincts, you could say, are being twisted to serve another class. And, again, the only way to escape that isn't by like, oh, well, I'm going to advocate for a system where we'll just move the money around. Or in some ways, you look at communism, and communism said, well, capitalism isn't good because it's not equal enough. And that, to me, essentially communism was a religion. It was secular, it was atheistic, but it was a religion. And as a result, instead of a merchant class ruling over the Soviet Union, what ended up happening is because of the Civil War and World War II, it was essentially ruled by bureaucrats who, I would argue, are priests in their mentality. And it was ruled by warriors who were these generals. Stalin, his big thing, he got to power because he was a successful bureaucrat, but also because he was a general in these wars. He was a bank robber, So that was his mentality. And so even though communism was invented with a very economical, quantitative outlook, because of the class incentives in the people who had power, it turned out, in a sense, being more conservative, so to speak, than America around, the 1980s or whatever. Or even earlier, even during the 60s, right? So it's not so much of like, okay, well, maybe if we pass this regulation, like, of course, there's all sorts of things, you could talk about UBI. You could talk about, I would say, a wealth tax on anybody making more than $1 billion, confiscate their wealth, right? But all of those big changes cannot happen. Those policy changes cannot happen as long as we have this power structure. So before we can even talk about those policy changes, we really need to be talking about how do we develop technologies and religions. I have nothing to say about technology. I just know it exists, it's real, it's out there. And other people can talk about that who are competent. I'm not. But so the only thing I can really talk about is religion. Religion as a vector of changing, the class structure. And again, I think in some ways, communism was a religious vector for changing the class structure. Was it perfect? Do I then call myself a communist and say, let's do a rerun of that? No, because ultimately communism as a religion failed, and actually the vestiges of communism have been fully integrated into capitalism, and that most people who call themselves communists are not concerned with the billionaire class. They're actually on the side of the billionaire class, and they're fighting for, obscurantist social rights that hurt, your average working class person. I'm not a distributist. I'm not a Catholic. Is it bad manners to ask for book recommendations? I don't read books, so yes. I don't read books. I read Wikipedia articles. True. What podcast do you like watching? I like the Deep Left Jokkull Experience. Have you read James C.? No, haven't read books. Trudel Tom's calling you a hobbit manlet. Where is he calling me a hobbit manlet? We'll find out next time, because that's all I'm going to do tonight. I don't really, to be honest with y'all, it was sort of a late stream. This one probably isn't going to get many likes or whatever. I just wanted to do it on DLive, and then DLive wasn't working tonight. I don't know if I've been banned from DLive. I don't know what's going on with that. We'll try again tomorrow. I prefer to do that because honestly, when I put out too many videos on YouTube, people don't have time to watch them because people are doing other things with their lives other than watching a YouTube stream. So if I put out like one video per week, then people actually get to watch all the streams. Whereas if I put out a lot of streams, then people don't see it, and then I'm just, that's not good, right? So we're going to try DLive again. Maybe I'll get on this Trovo app. We'll try out Trovo. We'll see what happens with that. Then that'll be a real esoteric stream. But thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. The goal for today, I guess I forgot to talk about this, is 70 likes as per usual and 30 unique user comments. So don't make more than one comment per user. I don't want to see people making multiple comments. That's ridiculous. If you have more things to say, you can edit your comment. But what I want, preferably, this is my preference, not necessary, but I'm asking if you would please timestamp, and don't just post a blank timestamp, post a timestamp in a couple words. Doesn't have to be a full sentence, could be 3 words about what that time, okay, at this timestamp, he talks about X, Y, and Z. It can just be timestamp, what did we talk about in this stream? I'm trying to timestamp religion, timestamp tobacco, timestamp posture, whatever, so that people see those keywords, and then, when we're looking back at the timestamps, we have an idea of what we're looking at. So, because this was a pretty low-key stream at a late hour, and it was not like the most intensive stream I've ever done, and it was done back-to-back with a stream earlier this week, it's going to take a long time for us to get to the 70 likes and the 30 unique comments, but we'll take a break. Triddle Tom, Neuroposter, will have his podcast up tomorrow, apparently, so that you can look forward to that. That is all for me today.